The UK-based monitoring group airwars.org says hundreds of civilians have been killed in US-led airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Coalition forces have rarely acknowledged civilian casualties in the controversial year-long campaign. Now, calls for greater transparency. CCTV's Roee Ruttenberg has been following the story and joins us from the newsroom. Roee, what's in this report exactly?
Well, Asiya, essentially it's the numbers. The group says the U.S. surely knows, but simply isn't willing to talk about. Some 5,700 airstrikes with dozens of strikes allegedly hitting and killing civilians.
This amateur video claims to show the aftermath of coalition airstrikes on Raqqa in early July. The Syrian city is considered, in effect, the ISIL capital. Witnesses say the strikes killed both militants and civilians, including a 10-year-old child. This was the official footage released by the U.S. military, which confirmed 16 strikes that same weekend, but said nothing about civilian deaths. In a rare telephone briefing just 1 month earlier, the lead coalition commander said its airstrikes are the most precise and disciplined in the history of aerial warfare, minimizing civilian casualties. But a UK-based monitoring group says the facts on the ground show a gulf between public and coalition positions.
In a year of coalition strikes that have been taking place in Iraq and Syria on Islamic State, it's our best understanding at the moment that around 450 to perhaps 600 civilians have most likely been killed by the coalition. That compares with just 2 civilian deaths the coalition has presently admitted to.
Allahu Akbar.
Woods believes at least 50 civilians were killed by a strike last December. They were being held in a makeshift ISIL jail in Al-Bab. The building was leveled in what Woods says was one of the deadliest attacks. The U.S. made no mention of casualties, but his group insists the reports are credible.
It's easier to track civilians killed on the ground because relatives, friends, monitoring organizations kick up a fuss, they make a noise, they chronicle those deaths, they'll publish videos. And many of the individuals we're talking about killed here are women and children. They are clearly not terrorist fighters.
Some warn the air campaign and subsequent casualty count will eventually backfire.
For every one of these casualties, someone in their family is going to be really, really angry. Some of them are going to take up arms for revenge. And that's what creates terrorism. So if we're serious about stopping terrorism, we're doing everything wrong.
Now, a Pentagon spokesperson told me on Monday the U.S. wouldn't, quote, speculate on civilian casualties, and added that 6 allegations, 4 in Iraq and 2 in Syria, are currently being investigated. Critics say it's a step towards more transparency, but there's still a lot more officials just aren't willing to admit.
So why is that, Roee? Why is this hesitation in Washington not to talk about civilian casualties?
Well, this is nothing new. If you remember back in 2003, Donald Rumsfeld, the then Secretary of Defense, said, we don't do body counts of the other. That was sort of seen as quite crass, but indicating that the U.S. was not keeping a tally of the amount of civilians killed in the Iraq War. And we're seeing that narrative continuing now. Groups criticize the U.S., saying it has no problem counting the number of what it says are ISIL militants killed in airstrikes. It puts that number at around 15,000, and it should be offering that same statistic, that same scrutiny in discussing civilians. But they say it's an uncomfortable thing for the United States to discuss traditionally, and that's why we're seeing that hesitation now.
All right, CCTV Roee Ruttenberg, thank you so much.